content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Kathy, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 26th issue of the New York Times Business section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Bitcoin's greatest mystery. The cryptocurrency's creator has hidden behind the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto for years, but clues buried in emails, texts, and online posts led to a computer scientist named Adam Back. By John Carreyrou with Dylan Friedman. A deep dive aims to find the creator of Bitcoin, the person who shook up the finance world by spawning a $2.4 trillion cryptocurrency industry is a mystery. But efforts to piece together bits of evidence pointed to one name. One evening in the fall of 2024, my wife and I were sitting in traffic on the Long Island Expressway when, tired of listening to the jazz funk station I often played on our drives, she switched to a podcast. It was Hard Fork, the New York Times tech show, and the hosts were discussing a new HBO documentary claiming to have unmasked Bitcoin's pseudonymous inventor, Satoshi Nakamoto. I was instantly riveted. I had long considered the question of Satoshi's true identity one of our age's great enigmas, and had poked at it before without success. 2 years earlier, I had even spent several months researching a book on the subject. But I soon realized I was out of my depth and reluctantly gave up. Hearing that someone else might have finally identified the shadowy figure who had revolutionized finance, spawned a $2.4 trillion industry, and amassed one of the world's biggest fortunes in one stroke of staggering genius aroused in me a mixture of admiration and envy. I couldn't wait to watch the film. As soon as we got home that night, I logged into the HBO Max app and pressed play. In the end, I found the conclusion of Money Electric, the Bitcoin mystery, unconvincing. HBO singled out a Canadian software developer based on what seemed like very thin evidence. But as I watched what was otherwise entertaining romp through the world of crypto, one scene caught my attention. Adam Back, a British cryptographer and leading figure in the Bitcoin movement, sat on a park bench in Riga, Latvia, his shirt untucked under a brown coat. The filmmaker casually rattled off the names of several Satoshi suspects. At the mention of his own name, Mr. Back tensed up, strenuously denied he was Satoshi, and asked that the conversation be kept off the record. Having encountered my share of liars and developed something of an expertise in their tells, Mr. Back's demeanor, his shifty eyes, his awkward chuckle, the jerky movement of his left hand, struck me as fishy. When the credits rolled up, I replayed the sequence several times on my TV. While I pondered Mr. Back's reaction, another thought occurred to me. An Australian imposter had been sued for falsely claiming he was Satoshi. What if the evidence disclosed in that court case, which had been tried in London a few months earlier, could help me unravel the mystery? As anyone steeped in Bitcoin lore will tell you, Satoshi was a master at the art of maintaining anonymity on the internet, leaving few, if any, digital footprints behind. But Satoshi did leave behind a corpus of texts, including a 9-page white paper outlining his invention and his many posts on the Bitcoin Talk Forum, an online message board where users gathered to discuss the digital currency's software, economics, and philosophy. And that corpus, it turned out, had expanded significantly during the imposter's civil trial when Marty Malmi, a Finnish programmer who collaborated with Satoshi in Bitcoin's early days, released a trove of hundreds of emails he had exchanged with him. Emails Satoshi sent to other early Bitcoin adopters had surfaced before, but none came close in volume to the Malmi dump. If Satoshi was ever going to be found, I was convinced the key lay somewhere in those texts. Then again, others must have gone down this road before me. Journalists, academics, and internet sleuths have been trying to identify Satoshi for 16 years. During that span, more than 100 names have been put forward, including those of an Irish cryptography student, an unemployed Japanese American engineer, a South African criminal mastermind, and the mathematician portrayed in the movie A Beautiful Mind. The most alluring theories had focused on coincidences that aligned with what little was known about Satoshi. A particular code writing style, a mysterious work history, an expertise in Bitcoin's key technical concepts, an anti-government worldview, but they had run aground under the weight of an alibi or some other piece of inconsistent or contrary evidence. Each failure had been met with glee by many members of the Bitcoin community. As they like to point out, only Satoshi could definitely prove his identity by moving some of his coins. Any evidence short of that would be circumstantial. It seemed foolish to think that I could somehow crack a case that had confounded so many others. But I craved the thrill of a big, challenging story. So I decided to try once more to unmask Bitcoin's mysterious creator. 1. A series of clues. 2 thin leads. I started by looking for ways to narrow the field. One thing that jumped out in Satoshi's emails to Mr. Malmi and in his other writings was that he mixed British spelling and idioms with American expressions. Since many Satoshi subjects are American, some have speculated that he disguised his prose with Britishisms. But I never bought that theory because of a clue Satoshi left us. In Bitcoin's first block of transactions, Satoshi embedded text from a newspaper headline, The Times, 03 January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. The headline in question appeared in the Times of London's British print edition. This felt like a sign that Satoshi really was British. Satoshi was also very likely a member of the Cyberpunks, a group of anarchists formed in the early 1990s who wanted to use cryptography, the art of securing communications through code, to free individuals from government surveillance and censorship. The cyberpunks interacted mostly through something called an internet mailing list. Ancestors of today's message boards, mailing lists were large group emails in old typewriter font that subscribers received in their inbox. To communicate, respondents replied all. It's hard to picture in the age of Venmo and Apple Pay, but one of the cyberpunks' biggest concerns was the digitization of financial transactions. When you hand someone a $20 bill, no one knows where it came from. But when you pay for something with a check or a credit card, banks keep computer records. Cyberpunks worried the government would use those records to track people's lives. On their mailing list, they brainstormed about how to create electronic cash, digital money that would preserve the anonymity of physical currency. Some even came up with their own electronic cash systems, but none caught on until Bitcoin. Besides their shared interest in digital cash, there were other indications Satoshi belonged to the group. He announced his white paper on an offshoot of the cyberpunks mailing list called the Cryptography List, and he seemed familiar with 2 of the group's members. At its peak in the late 1900s, the cyberpunks counted some 2,000 followers, so that still left a wide pool of candidates. Armed with these admittedly thin leads, I pored over Satoshi's body of writing, especially the emails released by Mr. Malmi, and made a list of words and phrases that stood out to me. It felt like trying to decipher a foreign dialect. More than once, I wondered whether I was engaging in a useless exercise. My list eventually grew to more than 100 words and phrases, taking up several pages in my notebook. Among those that caught my eye, dang, backup, used as a verb in one word, human-friendly, on principle, burning the money, abandonware, hand-tuned, and partial pre-image. One phrase, a menace to the network, sounded like a line from a science fiction movie. The rest hinted at a weird combination of upper-class Britain, American redneck, computer geek, and cryptographer. Using the advanced search function on the social media platform X, I did a cursory search to see if any of the dozen or so people most often suspected of being Satoshi used the terms I had highlighted. Not all Satoshi suspects have X accounts, so this wasn't meant to be scientific. But just as I had hoped, one person was a match for nearly all of my words and phrases: Mr. Back. Staring at a long column of check marks I had jotted in my notebook under his name, I felt a rush of adrenaline. My hunch now seemed at least partly founded. Mr. Back's use of many of the same terms as Satoshi might not prove anything to a community that had been consumed with this topic for many years, but I doubted it was just chance. As I took a closer look at Mr. Back, I realized he had several attributes that were consistent with Satoshi. For starters, he was British and he was a cyberpunk. More important, Mr. Back had invented Hashcash, a statistical puzzle-solving system that Satoshi borrowed from the mining of bitcoins. Satoshi has cited Mr. Back and Hashcash in his white paper. But Mr. Back had produced emails during the Australian imposters trial showing that Satoshi had contacted him in August 2008 before publishing the Bitcoin white paper to check his citation of Mr. Back's Hashcash paper. Those emails seemed like proof that Mr. Back couldn't be Satoshi. As I thought about it, however, I glimpsed a different possibility. Mr. Back could just as well have sent those emails to himself as a cover story. Down the cryptography rabbit hole. With his wired rimmed glasses, thinning gray hair, and goatee, Mr. Back, 55, looks like a disheveled mathematician. Over the past years, he has built a mini empire of Bitcoin-related companies and become one of the community's most influential members. Mr. Back has long been among the top Satoshi candidates, but unlike some other leading suspects, he hadn't been the subject of close journalistic scrutiny, other than in a 2020 video by an anonymous YouTuber who goes by the handle Barely Sociable. A year ago, I flew to Las Vegas to meet him. He was scheduled to speak at the Bitcoin 2025 conference at the Venetian Resort. I wasn't sure I had the right person, so I wasn't planning on confronting him yet. I just wanted to get to know him and learn more about his background. If my reporting bore out, I envisioned cornering him with all of my evidence later in a final dramatic showdown, like a police detective trying to extract a confession from a murder suspect. But for now, I wanted to put him at ease and establish a rapport. I approached Mr. Back after watching him confidently predict on a panel that Bitcoin, then trading around $108,000, would reach $1 million easy in 5 to 10 years. Fittingly, conference organizers had christened the stage he spoke on the Nakamoto stage. He seemed slightly startled even though I had arranged an interview ahead of time. I told Mr. Back only that I was working on a story about the history of Bitcoin, but he may have suspected what I was really up to because I had already contacted 6 former colleagues from 3 companies he had been involved with. If he did, he didn't show it. He was patient and friendly. It was hard to fathom that this soft-spoken, middle-aged nerd who took no visible security precautions might be one of the world's richest people. According to Bitcoin lore, Satoshi had mined 1.1 million coins in the digital currency's early days, a hoard worth $118 billion at the time of the conference. I found Mr. Back talkative when it came to Bitcoin, but more reticent when I shifted the conversation to his early life. I eventually elicited the following from him. He was born in London in 1970. His father was an entrepreneur and his mother was legal secretary. They moved around a lot and family members had strong opinions and weren't shy about voicing them. Mr. Back said he taught himself how to code on a Timex Sinclair personal computer at age 11 and took an interest in cryptography in high school. That became a passion at the University of Exeter when a fellow student turned Mr. Back, who was pursuing a PhD in computer science, onto PGP, a free encryption program used by anti-nuclear activists and human rights groups to shield their files and emails from government surveillance. Mr. Back was so taken with the many potential applications of PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, that he said he spent most of his PhD diving down the cryptography rabbit hole. He got so sidetracked, he recalled, that he had to cram his thesis into the last 6 months at the university, comparing himself to a pilot crash landing a plane. I learned enough by then to know that PGP relies on public key cryptography. So does Bitcoin. A Bitcoin user has two keys: a public key, from which an address is derived that acts as a digital safe deposit box, and a private key, which is the secret combination used to unlock that box and spend the coins it contains. How interesting, I thought, that Mr. Back's grad school hobby involved the same cryptographic technique that Satoshi had repurposed. The topic of Mr. Back's PhD thesis, he told me, was distributed computer systems, programs that rely on a web of independent computers known in computer parlance as nodes to work together to run their software. This was another technological pillar of Bitcoin. And Mr. Back's thesis project focused on a C++, the same programming language Satoshi used to code the first version of the Bitcoin software. After nearly 2 hours, Mr. Back politely signaled that he had other commitments that evening, so we cordially parted ways. I told him I would be in touch if I had other questions. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Business section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Becoming a Cyberpunk. Before my trip to Las Vegas, I had begun to immerse myself in the archives of the Cyberpunk's mailing list to learn more about the strange underground world that had produced Satoshi. When I returned to New York, I plunged back in. Under a social media platform like Facebook, the Cyberpunks list was a decentralized communication forum. Privacy-minded cryptography geeks gathered there to bat around subversive ideas without fear of being censored. In the process, they planted the seeds for innovations that would change the course of financial history. Their messages were preserved for posterity on several obscure websites. One of them greeted me with a skull and crossbones logo and the slogan, "Arise, you have nothing to lose but your barbed wire fences." I found myself staring at thousands of emails dense with crypto speak I barely grasped. Mr. Back joined the list in the summer of 1995, toward the end of his graduate studies. He quickly became a vocal participant, churning out posts on topics ranging from digital privacy to his miserly spending habits. In one of his first posts, he solved a cryptographic challenge, a sort of mathematical riddle, posted by Hal Finney, a cyberpunk from California who had worked on PGP. It was the beginning of an online friendship. Decades later, Mr. Back tweeted that he and Mr. Finney had interacted numerous times on and off the list, and he admired Mr. Finney's focus and coding chops. Satoshi, too, was friendly with Mr. Finney. When Satoshi unveiled his white paper, Mr. Finney complimented it. Later, Mr. Finney volunteered to receive some bitcoins in what became the world's first Bitcoin transaction. There was no evidence that Mr. Finney knew who Satoshi was, but one of their interactions suggested Satoshi was familiar with Mr. Finney. In December 2010, Mr. Finney wrote a post on Bitcoin Talk praising the Bitcoin code. 2 hours later, Satoshi replied, "That means a lot coming from you, Hal." There was something else that made me think Satoshi and Mr. Finney shared a history. In one of his emails to Mr. Malmi, Satoshi made a reference to an electronic cash system Mr. Finney had invented called reusable proofs of work. Like Bitcoin, RPOW incorporated Hashcash into its design, but unlike Bitcoin, it had attracted virtually no interest from the cryptographic community. Only a handful of people had commented on it on the cyberpunks and cryptography lists. One of the few who had was Mr. Back. A gold nugget. In the cyberpunks, Mr. Back had found his ideological soulmates. I pictured him in his home in London, logging onto the internet with a dial-up modem after work and whiling the nights away in philosophical arguments with other group members half a world away. Like many of his new pals, Mr. Back embraced crypto-anarchy, an ideology that essentially meant using cryptography to shield individuals' lives from state encroachment. As a libertarian, Mr. Back was incensed when the Clinton administration opened a criminal investigation into PGP's founder. At the time, the U.S. government considered encryption programs vital to national security and believed that the release of PGP's source code online was tantamount to exporting banned munitions. In protest, Mr. Back made T-shirts with a strong encryption algorithm printed on them and mailed them to cyberpunks in other countries. His point was that the U.S. ban on the export of sensitive cryptography violated free speech principles and couldn't be enforced. As I delighted in the cleverness of Mr. Back's prank, it dawned on me that Satoshi, too, had used code to send political messages. Satoshi had most likely embedded that Times of London headline in the first block of transactions, in part to decry the British government's bank bailouts during the financial crisis, which was raging at the time. Satoshi had planted another political message on a popular website with fans of decentralized technologies. He claimed that his date of birth was April 5th, 1975. April 5th was the day in 1933 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt had banned the private ownership of gold to allow the government to devalue the dollar during the Great Depression, and 1975 was the year the ban had ended. The financial commentator Dominic Frisby had spotted this Easter egg more than a decade ago and recognized its meaning. Bitcoin was a digital version of gold that the state could neither outlaw nor devalue. But no one seemed to have noticed this short post from Mr. Back in 2002. Just curious, what was the rationale under which private possession of gold was made illegal in the U.S.? It boggles the mind. Spam on the brain. As I chewed on this odd coincidence, I noticed something else Satoshi and Mr. Back had in common, a weird preoccupation with spam. Among his various cyberpunk hobbies, Mr. Back ran a remailer, a service that enabled its users to communicate anonymously by stripping identifying data from their emails before forwarding them on. To his great annoyance, spammers took advantage of it to bombard people with garbage. Mr. Back invented Hashcash in March 1997 as a way to fight back. The idea was to impose a postage fee on every email sent through his remailer. The postage fees were paid in Hashcash, which users generated by solving little mathematical problems requiring lots of calculations. The math problems took a computer only a few seconds to solve, but they imposed a costly computer resource burden on spammers who were sending hundreds of thousands of emails at a time. While reading through the Satoshi corpus a second and then a third time, I began seeing the word spam everywhere. By my count, Satoshi mentioned it 24 times, and he often expressed ideas identical to Mr. Back's. 5 months after unveiling Hashcash, Mr. Back suggested on the Cyberpunks list that his invention could be useful to celebrities as a way to filter their emails. In a January 2009 post to the cryptography list, Satoshi proposed a similar use for Bitcoin. It wasn't an obvious use for Satoshi's new electronics money unless filtering junk email was on your brain, as it had been on Mr. Back's for more than a decade. Satoshi also believed that Bitcoin could lead to an overall reduction in spam. Days after releasing his white paper, he argued that his creation might give the armies of zombie computers commandeered by hackers to flood email inboxes a new purpose, generating Bitcoins instead. His argument didn't gain any traction, and spam continued to proliferate. Yet Mr. Back would make the very same point on Bitcoin Talk 4 years later. Maybe spam would even fall if Hashcash CPU/GPU mining is a more profitable market than spamming. It seems to me highly likely that it would be. Mr. Average. I was having less luck finding cracks in Satoshi's deep cover that might lead to a true smoking gun. Conventional wisdom was that he had made 2 mistakes. The first one involved a leaked IP address that appeared to place him in Southern California when he launched the Bitcoin software. The other involved a hack of one of his email addresses. After weeks pursuing both leads, I concluded that not only were they dead ends, they probably weren't mistakes in the first place. How was I going to find someone so good at hiding his tracks? As I wrestled with this question, it occurred to me that Mr. Back, too, was adept at operating anonymously on the internet. Deeply paranoid about government monitoring, he constantly gamed out ways to elude it. In fact, like Satoshi, Mr. Beck was a big fan of using pseudonyms. You must be below the radar belt. You must be essentially invisible to the government. The Spooks dossier on You Must Read Mr. Average and be entirely wholesome, he wrote in January 1998. Then you must have one or more alter egos for your real interests. Satoshi's chosen alter ego was from Japan. As it happened, Mr. Beck had expressed interest in the country in 1997, when a Japanese cyberpunk posted to the list about the creation of Japan's first remailer. "Congrats on starting a remailer in a new jurisdiction," Mr. Beck responded. "Jurisdiction shopping is good, too. Wonder what Japan offers as a jurisdiction opportunity. Are there things legal in Japan which are not legal in Europe or US?" The Japanese cyberpunk didn't answer, but that wouldn't have prevented Mr. Beck from later conducting a little research on his own. If he did, he might have come across a company with a Tokyo address called Anonymous Speech LLC that offered anonymous email and web hosting. Satoshi used its services to register the Bitcoin.org website and to create 2 untraceable email accounts. In 1999, Mr. Beck moved to Montreal to take a job with a startup that specialized in privacy software. There, he helped build a privacy system called the Freedom Network that allowed its users to browse the internet anonymously. It was a precursor to the Onion Router, a network better known by its acronym, Tor, that anonymizes internet traffic. There is widespread consensus in the Bitcoin community that Satoshi used Tor to hide his footprints. Like Bitcoin, the Freedom Network was a distributed computer system. Mr. Beck and his colleagues tried to make it impervious to government and corporate monitoring. That was another trait he shared with Satoshi, whose Bitcoin posts displayed a deep knowledge of network security and how to guard against vulnerabilities. The Bitcoin network is widely admired for how well it has withstood hacking attempts. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times business section on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Napster versus Gnutella. After several months in the depths of the Cyberpunks list archives, I sometimes lost track of where I was in my research and followed false leads down bizarre cul-de-sacs. While responding to one of the first criticisms of his white paper on the cryptography list, Satoshi had written, "I didn't really make that statement as strong as I could have." I thought I had seen that phrase before and spent several evenings wading through hundreds of 1990s mailing list posts I'd already read. It soon became clear I'd imagined it. But my rereading wasn't all in vain. Other parallels between Mr. Beck and Satoshi started to become apparent. For instance, Mr. Beck and Satoshi shared a dislike for copyright. "Scrap patents and copyright," Mr. Beck wrote in September 1997. In keeping with this belief, Mr. Beck made his Hashcash spam throttling software open source. Satoshi did a similar thing. He released the Bitcoin software under MIT's open source license, which allowed anyone to use, modify, and distribute it without restrictions. In the spirit of building something in the public domain, Mr. Beck and Satoshi also both created internet mailing lists dedicated to their creations, the Hashcash list and the Bitcoin-dev list, where they posted software updates listing new features and bug fixes in a format and style that looked strikingly familiar. Satoshi's Beck-like bias against copyright surfaced in other ways. He expressly waived copyright when he shared images of a Bitcoin logo he had designed on Bitcoin Talk, and he encouraged people who wanted to improve upon it to make their graphics public domain. In the early 2000s, copyright enforcement became mainstream news when the popular file-sharing service Napster shut down after being sued by big music companies. Napster was what's known as peer-to-peer software, where users share content with one another directly, eliminating the need for a corporate middleman. Mr. Beck was appalled. He shared with the Cyberpunks list a paper written by an intellectual property lawyer that detailed all the legal threats that makers of peer-to-peer software now faced. My conclusion after reading this, Mr. Back wrote, is that the safest and simplest thing to do is to just publish such software anonymously. Bitcoin, like Napster, was peer-to-peer software. Substitute the government for the music industry, and a similar scenario could unfold. If its creator's identity became known, government lawyers would know whom to go after. If it stayed concealed, there would be no one to sue. If Mr. Back and Satoshi were the same person, that would help explain why Satoshi chose to hide. The music companies were protecting their business interests. The government would have a different agenda, protecting its monopoly over money. Like Mr. Back, Satoshi considered Napster's demise a cautionary tale. He was alluding to the fact that even though its users exchanged songs directly, Napster still used a central server to keep a list of who had what songs. By contrast, Gnutella, another file-sharing service, ran on a network of independent computers spread out all over the world, just like Bitcoin. This made for yet another fascinating coincidence. In a May 2000 post, Mr. Back had drawn the same comparison between Napster and Gnutella. Mr. Back hadn't made this comparison just once. He had made it 3 separate times on the cyberpunks list. 2. Buried roadmap. Outlining Bitcoin a decade before Bitcoin. All these similarities were intriguing, but I didn't have anything that tied Mr. Back directly to the creation of Bitcoin. That changed when I discovered a cluster of cyberpunks posts Mr. Back had written between 1997 and 1999, a decade before Bitcoin was introduced. On April 30th, 1997, he suggested creating an electronic cash system entirely disconnected from modern banking that would have 4 key attributes. It would preserve the privacy of both payer and payee. It would be distributed across a network of computers to make it hard to shut down. It would have some built-in scarcity to prevent excessive inflation, and it wouldn't require trust in any individual or bank. To achieve the latter, he suggested a 5th component 2 days later, a publicly verifiable protocol. All 5 of these elements later became core to Bitcoin. 4 months later, Mr. Back returned to the topic of electronic cash, introducing a new feature rooted in game theory. An application I've put a bit of thought into is the idea of creating a distributed banking system, he wrote. Ideally, it is a system where all nodes are equivalent and k of n of those nodes have to collude before they can compromise the operation of the bank. Mr. Back was alluding to the Byzantine generals problem, a computer science problem that bedevils decentralized systems. In the analogy, n number of generals surrounds an enemy city at war with Byzantium. To invade successfully, they must all agree to attack at the same time, but a subset of K generals may be traitors and sabotage the plan. This is also true of distributed computer networks. They can be sabotaged by malicious participants or nodes in the network. Mr. Back wanted to create an electronic cash network with so many nodes in so many different places that no one in the mood to sabotage it will be able to find enough conspirators. That sounded a lot like the system Satoshi described in his white paper 11 years later. Bitcoin would work, Satoshi wrote, as long as a majority of CPU power is controlled by nodes that are not cooperating to attack the network. In his 1997 Cyberpunks list post, Mr. Back wrote of nodes that could come and go without affecting the network's operations. In his white paper, Satoshi wrote that nodes could leave and rejoin the networks at will. The phrasing was slightly different, but it didn't require a crack cryptographer to see that Mr. Back and Satoshi had proposed the exact same concepts. On December 6, 1998, Mr. Back returned once more to the topic of electronic cash after another cyberpunk, Y-Dai, floated his own idea, called B-Money. As the YouTuber Barely Sociable pointed out in his 2020 video, Mr. Back seized on Mr. Dai's proposal. B-Money used public key cryptography to anonymize users' accounts, preserving the privacy of payer and payee as Mr. Back had envisioned. And it had another feature Mr. Back liked. One problem that confronts anyone trying to create a digital currency is how to mint coins. Mr. Dye proposed a system in which users who solved a computational problem would be rewarded with newly minted B-money coins. Mr. Back's Hashcash invention did something very similar. It rewarded users who solved computational problems with permission to send emails. He suggested repurposing Hashcash and making it the mechanism to mint Mr. Dye's electronic coins. This was significant because Satoshi had cited Mr. Dye in his white paper and later described Bitcoin as an implementation of Y. Dye's B-money proposal. When I stopped to think about it, it was uncanny. Just as Mr. Back proposed to do in 1998, Satoshi combined the Hashcash and B-money concepts to create Bitcoin. What were the chances of that? That wasn't all. In the comments he made about B-money in December 1998, Mr. Back anticipated Satoshi's inflation solution. Any electronic coin minted by solving computational problems was bound to suffer from runaway inflation because as computer chips got more powerful, it would become easier for computers to solve the problems and mint new coins. To get around this issue, Mr. Back suggested that minting B-money coins should require more computational effort over time. That's exactly how Satoshi designed the Bitcoin software. He programmed it so that each new block of Bitcoin transactions would take an average of 10 minutes to mine and created an algorithm that increased the problem-solving difficulty when faster computer chips began to shrink that time interval. As if all these prescient insights were not enough, Mr. Back proposed another crucial concept in April 1999. For distributed electronic cash to work, there needed to be a public, immutable timestamp of every transaction. Otherwise, a user could spend one coin twice, sending the whole system into chaos. Mr. Back's solution involved using hash trees, which condense large amounts of data into a single digital fingerprint, and publishing those fingerprints in New York Times classified ads. Satoshi used the same idea as for Bitcoin, but replaced the classified ads component with Mr. Back's Hashcash, which time-stamped transactions by making the intensive computations used to package them into blocks too expensive and time-consuming to forge. Mr. Back even foreshadowed Satoshi's response to one of the main criticisms later levied against Bitcoin, its heavy electricity use. He argued in 1998 and 1999 that the energy burned by a combination of Hashcash and B-money would probably be less than what the banking system consumed. When an early reader of the Bitcoin white paper raised the issue a decade later, Satoshi made a similar argument. In short, Mr. Back envisioned nearly every facet of Bitcoin and used the same rationalization as Satoshi to excuse its main flaw, a decade before Bitcoin was created. Radio silence. A month after our meeting in Vegas, I emailed Mr. Back some questions about his work history and about why he had moved to Malta in 2009. I didn't say why I was asking, but some members of the Bitcoin community had pointed out that the European tax haven would make an ideal home for Satoshi and his trove of Bitcoins. Mr. Back replied the next day, politely, but seemingly with a firm grasp of the implication of my question. He moved to Malta for several reasons, including cost of living, weather, and, yes, taxes. He wrote, "Bitcoiners love sleuthing, but coincidences do happen and don't necessarily mean anything." He clearly knew what I was up to. It was time to test the waters further by broaching something that had been bothering me. Satoshi had cited both Hashcash and B-money in his white paper, but the emails Mr. Back produced for the trial of Craig Wright, the Australian imposter, made it seem as if Satoshi wasn't yet aware of B-money as of August 2008, when he reached out to Mr. Back to check whether he was citing his Hashcash paper correctly. It was only after Mr. Back referred him to Mr. Dye's website that Satoshi added the B-money citation to his white paper, the emails suggested. But it didn't add up to me. Mr. Back's Hashcash paper specifically discussed B-Money as an application for Hashcash. Presuming Satoshi read the paper he was planning to cite, he would have had to know about B-Money. Mr. Back acknowledged this contradiction in 2020. After he suggested on X that Satoshi might be an anonymous cyberpunk who had posted about electronic cash, another user questioned his theory, noting that the anonymous cyberpunk had mentioned B-Money and that Satoshi had only learned about B-Money many years later from Mr. Back. Yes, Mr. Back responded, but Satoshi could have lied to him and pretended not to know about B-Money. If Satoshi knew some very obscure citation, maybe he would not cite it to avoid triangulation, he wrote. Someone like Mr. Back, who was one of only 6 named users to have discussed B-Money on the cyberpunks and cryptography lists, and who had mentioned it no fewer than 60 times, might especially want to avoid this sort of triangulation. The more I mulled it over, the more suspicious I had become that Mr. Back had written the Satoshi emails to himself in an elaborate ruse to divert suspicion away from himself. So I decided to ask Mr. Back for the email's metadata. Metadata is to an email what an envelope, postmark, and seal are to a physical letter. It shows where the email came from, when it was sent, and whether it was altered. The copies of Mr. Back's email exchanges with Satoshi, made public during Mr. Wright's London trial, hadn't included this information. I didn't have high hopes the metadata would tell me anything useful, because Satoshi had used the Tokyo Registered Anonymous email service, which would have masked his IP address. Not only that, Satoshi had probably used Tor to connect to the service to further insulate himself. I still wanted to see it, though, on the off chance I could glean some clue. But when I emailed Mr. Back my request, he did not reply. I wasn't sure if he was ghosting me or just busy, and I didn't want to spook him by immediately following up. So I waited 8 days to send him another email. Again, radio silence. I had clearly touched a nerve. But why? With the precautions Satoshi had taken, what was there to even hide? Unless Satoshi had made some sort of mistake? Satoshi appears, Mr. Back disappears. After unveiling Bitcoin on Halloween 2008, Satoshi spent the next 2.5 years improving it with the help of a clutch of early enthusiasts who lent their software engineering expertise to the project. Satoshi frequently coordinated with the group, which later became known as the Bitcoin Core Developers, on Bitcoin Talk and by email. Then famously, he disappeared on April 26, 2011. Mr. Back, it turned out, followed that same pattern, but in reverse. For more than a decade, whenever electronic money was discussed on the cyberpunks or the cryptography list, Mr. Back had almost always chimed in, often with long, detailed posts. But when Bitcoin, the closest manifestation of the vision he had laid out, arrived, Mr. Back was nowhere to be found. Years later, in December 2013, he gave a very different version of events on the Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast. Mr. Back told its host that he had been very interested technically in Satoshi's invention when it came out and had participated in the discussion it sparked on the cryptography list. I combed through the list for any trace of such participation in the fall of 2008 and the winter of 2009 and found no evidence of it. In fact, Mr. Back continued to ignore Bitcoin entirely until June 2011, when he made his first public comment about it. That was 6 weeks after Satoshi vanished. This vocal advocate of electronic cash, who had floated ideas nearly identical to Bitcoin, showed little to no interest in it for years. But when he finally did get fully involved, it coincided with a new development that was sure to get Satoshi's attention. On April 17, 2013, an Argentine cryptographer named Sergio Damian Lerner published a blog item revealing Satoshi's fortune. That very day, Mr. Back joined Bitcoin Talk. After Mr. Lerner published a follow-up blog post a week later, Mr. Back wrote in the comments section, "I suppose it seems to you that you're getting too close. You might want to stop in Nakamoto's interests." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Business section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Suddenly all in. Suddenly, Mr. Back was all in. Within hours of introducing himself on Bitcoin Talk, he was proposing complicated system improvements. Within 2 weeks, he was demanding that Wikipedia restore its standalone Satoshi Nakamoto page, which had been deleted and merged into the Bitcoin page. And within 18 months, he had founded a startup called Blockstream to build tools that would make the Bitcoin network easier to use, faster, and more private. It was the beginning of an era in which Mr. Back quickly amassed influence and became a ringleader in the still small Bitcoin community. To staff Blockstream, he poached the top Bitcoin core developers from their day jobs at companies like Google and Mozilla, giving him tremendous sway over the digital currency. He also became very wealthy. Over the next dozen years, Blockstream and its affiliates would raise $1 billion in funding, and Blockstream would reach a valuation of $3.2 billion. It all seemed consistent with what Satoshi might do if he decided to reappear under the cover of his real name and take back the reins of his creation. In the fall of 2014, Mr. Back and his Blockstream colleagues published a white paper about an innovation Mr. Back had conceived called Pegged Sidechains. The paper, on which Mr. Back was the lead author, mentioned DigiCash. Founded by the cryptographer David Chaum in the late 1980s, DigiCash created a pioneering electronic currency that, unlike Bitcoin, relied on a central server it owned and operated. When DigiCash went bust in 1998, the currency went down with it. The requirement for a central server became the Achilles heel of DigiCash, the paper's introduction said. That was exactly how Satoshi had described DigiCash's failings 5 years earlier. Of course, the biggest difference is the lack of a central server. That was the Achilles heel of Chaumian systems, Satoshi wrote. The following year, in 2015, the Bitcoin community fractured over a proposal to increase Bitcoin's block size. A faction led by two Bitcoin developers, Gavin Andresen and Mike Hearn, wanted to make the blocks much bigger to accommodate more transactions. But this was controversial because bigger blocks would require users who ran Bitcoin nodes to have more powerful hardware and faster internet connections. If the cost of running a node became too high, users would be forced to shut them down, leaving the network in the hands of a few large data centers. That, in turn, would threaten the network's security because the data centers could collude to take it over. Mr. Back fiercely opposed increasing the block size. In a series of posts on the Bitcoin-dev list, he warned against it. Mr. Andresen and Mr. Hearn's proposal in increasingly strident tones. Then, out of the blue, Satoshi appeared on the list with an email that neatly dovetailed with Mr. Back's position. It was the first time Satoshi had been heard from in more than 4 years, other than a 5-word post the previous year denying a Newsweek article's claim to have unmasked him. Many in the Bitcoin community questioned the new email's authenticity, since another of Satoshi's email accounts had been hacked. But Mr. Back argued that the email sounded real. In a series of tweets, he called Satoshi's observations spot on and consistent with Satoshi views IMO, and took to quoting from the email. Mr. Back was very likely correct. To this day, there is no evidence to indicate the email was a forgery, and no other emails from that account have surfaced. The Satoshi email sounded much the way Mr. Back had in his posts during the preceding weeks, although no one took notice. Like Mr. Back, Satoshi argued that the Bitcoin network's increasing centralization jeopardized its security. He called the big block proposal very dangerous, the same term Mr. Back had used repeatedly. He also used other words and phrases Mr. Back had used: widespread consensus, consensus rules, technical, trivial, and robust. At the end of the email, Satoshi denounced Mr. Andresen and Mr. Hearn as two reckless developers trying to hijack Bitcoin with populist tactics, and added, "This present situation has been very disappointing to watch unfold." 4 days later, in the middle of a post to the same thread, Mr. Back wrote, "Very disappointing, Gavin and Mike." 3. Closing in. Alternative theories. I needed to stress test my theory. I tried to think of reasons I might be wrong. One argument I'd read in the book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, about the journalist Benjamin Wallace's long, inconclusive search for Satoshi, was that Mr. Back was a privacy absolutist, and Bitcoin's privacy features were weak. That seemed compelling at first blush. But rather than write Bitcoin off like other pro-privacy cyberpunks, Mr. Back had spent the past decade at Blockstream pioneering innovations to strengthen Bitcoin's privacy, which I felt weakened that argument considerably. On X, Mr. Back had cited another argument for why he can't be Satoshi. He asked too many dumb questions on the hashtag Bitcoin-Wizards Internet Relay chat channel when he first joined the community. The hashtag Bitcoin-Wizards IRC channel is an internet chat room where the Bitcoin core developers, or wizards, brainstormed about fixing bugs and improving the software. I read through the channel's logs and saw little evidence of a clueless beginner. I was struck by how attuned Mr. Back was to Bitcoin's vulnerabilities and how focused he was on shoring them up. Some of his ideas to improve the system were so sophisticated that they flew over the heads of the other wizards. I also noticed that he was cuttingly dismissive of other cryptocurrencies, writing at one point that he wanted to kill them all. What about other leading Satoshi suspects, I wondered? Were there any who fit the profile better than Mr. Back? A 2015 article in this newspaper put forward the thesis that Satoshi was Nick Szabo, an American computer scientist who proposed a Bitcoin-like idea called BitGold in 1998. Mr. Szabo remained at the top of many people's lists until recently, but a heated debate that played out on X about a proposed update to the Bitcoin core software exposed his ignorance of basic technical aspects of Bitcoin. Mr. Finney and Len Sassaman, a software engineer and privacy advocate, were two other oft-cited suspects. Over the course of much research, I ended up narrowing it down to 620 suspects. Looking at them, I wanted to know how many of them shared the other writing tics I'd identified in Satoshi's prose. First, we screened for the posters who sometimes put two spaces between sentences as Satoshi did. That eliminated 58 people and left us with 562 suspects. 9 of them were well-known Satoshi suspects. Then we screened for posters who used British spellings, which shortened our list to 434. We next turned to posters who sometimes confused its with an apostrophe with its, or vice versa. Applying that filter narrowed our pool to 114 candidates. Screening for those who finished some sentences with also, as Satoshi did, shrank the field to 56 posters. Of that group, we eliminated those who wrote bug fix as 2 words and halfway and downside as 1 word, which brought us down to 20 posters. From there, we eliminated the posters who, unlike Satoshi, correctly hyphenated the compound adjectives noun-based and file sharing, but did not hyphenate the compound noun double spending. That left 8 suspects. We then asked our database, how many of those remaining 8 suspects alternated between using email with a hyphen and email without a hyphen, eCash with a hyphen and electronic cash, check spelled with a Q and check spelled with CK, and the British and American forms of the word optimize, as Satoshi did? The answer was just 1, Mr. Back. Part 4, Face to Face. El Salvador. I still did not have definitive proof of Satoshi's identity. Only Satoshi himself could provide that if he used a private key associated with one of Bitcoin's first blocks. But I now had a wealth of evidence. In mid-November, I wrote to Mr. Back to request another interview. This time, I didn't beat around the bush. I wrote that I had concluded that he was Satoshi, and I wanted to show him everything I had uncovered and give him a chance to address it. I even offered to fly to Malta. Once again, he didn't reply. So I decided to approach him in person at a Bitcoin conference where he was scheduled to speak in El Salvador 2 months later. I walked up to him, reintroduced myself, and explained why I had come. He was slightly flustered, but to my pleasant surprise, he agreed to meet with me the next morning in the lobby of his hotel, which was doubling as the conference venue. When I arrived at the appointed hour, Mr. Back was flanked by 2 executives from a new Bitcoin treasury company he had co-founded. He explained that the company was in the process of going public, forcing him to be more careful about how he interacted with the press. After talking to Mr. Back for about 2 hours, I still had a few things I wanted to confront him with, but his aides said he had other meetings to attend. We took the elevator back down to the lobby and shook hands like 2 chess players after a hard-fought match. As I watched him disappear into the crowd of jovial conference-goers, something nagged at me. For a fleeting moment, I thought I had heard him slip and say something as though he was Satoshi himself, but I couldn't remember what it was. When I got home to New York, I found it in the recording I'd made of the interview. It was when I was walking him through the similarities between things he and Satoshi had written. I brought up one of Satoshi's quotes, but before I had a chance to explain why I was mentioning it, Mr. Back interrupted me. There's a quote that I mentioned earlier where Satoshi says, "I'm better with code than words." Adam Back. I did a lot of talking, though, for somebody. I mean, I'm not saying I'm good with words, but I sure did a lot of yakking on these lists, actually. To my ears, it sounded as if he was saying that for someone who preferred code over words, he sure had written a lot of words. Implicit in that was an acknowledgement that he had been the one who wrote the quotation. In other words, for a few seconds, Mr. Back had let the mask fall and turned into Satoshi. I emailed him to confront him about it a few days later. He denied that it was a slip. I was just responding conversationally to a general observation about technical people often feeling more comfortable expressing ideas in code than in prose, he said. But I had been crystal clear. I had asked about a specific Satoshi quotation, and I suspected Mr. Back knew that. I recalled how 10 years earlier, Satoshi had come out of hiding to help Mr. Back win the war over block size. And here Satoshi was, back again, in a luxury hotel in El Salvador. Only this time, he had served Mr. Back less well because he'd removed any lingering doubt in my mind that I had the right man. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 26th issue of the New York Times Business section. We read from the New York Times Business section every Thursday at 11 a.m. Your reader has been Kathy. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2, we have the conclusion of We Did OK Kid by Sir Anthony Hopkins. Stay with us for these readings and more.
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,